Prime Minister Mark Carney is reacting to the new twist in the ongoing trade dispute with the United States. He says he'll defend workers and businesses and continue to work to secure a trade deal. JP Tasker has been following the story for us from Ottawa. So, JP, how are officials in Ottawa viewing the latest Trump tariff threat?
Well, officials are very tight-lipped, frankly, about what has happened overnight in this new 35% tariff threat. We heard from Industry Minister Melanie Joly saying they won't negotiate in public. But I can tell you there's two schools of thought here in Ottawa, Chris. One is that we should absolutely take this latest threat very seriously and literally, and that it's possible Canadian goods could be hit with 35% tariffs on August 1st. It could be hugely damaging to the Canadian economy. I don't have to tell you that. Tens of billions of dollars worth of goods cross that border every day. And if they're facing a tariff like this, it could be hugely damaging. The other school of thought is that this is just a negotiation tactic from the president to the prime minister, because we know the deadline to get a deal on trade is fast approaching. You know, we're talking only a matter of days. And so there's a thought that maybe what Trump is trying to do here is ramp up the pressure on the Canadians to fold on some issues, to squeeze more out of us, to threaten this hugely damaging tariff rate so that we will cave on other things that matter most to us. So, you know, some folks saying, don't forget, Trump still thinks of himself as the chief negotiator, as the real estate magnate, as the guy who's used to doing this sort of things when it gets close to a deal, and that's maybe how we should interpret it. But people certainly preparing for both possibilities. One, that these tariffs could come into effect, and two, is just a way to get us to do more to make him happy.
And JP, of course, there are those moving goalposts, and the deadline has been moved yet again. What do you make of that?
Yeah, if you'll remember, they agreed at the G7 summit, Carney and Trump, that they would reach a deal in a month's time. So that would have been July 16th, July 17th. They then moved it to July 21st. Now the prime minister saying that the deadline for a trade deal is August 1st in advance of when these 35% tariffs could take effect. It tells me two things. One, that Trump is still very much open to getting a deal with Canada. I think he wants a win for the American people. I think he wants to say, look, all this tariff talk is paid off. I've been able to get a deal with one of our largest trading partners. That there's something to what I'm trying to do with this trading stuff. And second, I think that there is obviously some sticking points. So there are things that have not yet been resolved. And I think when you look at the president's letter to the prime minister last night, we can kind of read the tea leaves and see where there are some issues that are still outstanding. He talks about dairy again. This is one of his favorite topics, right? He feels like the Canadian supply managed sector is unfair to American farmers that are trying to sell into Canada. And he's raising that again. And obviously a lot of misinformation in that letter. He is misrepresenting what this tariff system is and what we put on their products. But it tells me that Canada is being reluctant to dismantle supply management for political reasons, economic reasons too, and that's what he's trying to get us to fold on potentially. I obviously don't know. Officials here aren't speaking to, frankly. The president's hard to make sense of what he says sometimes, but it tells me that could be a big issue, and Canada does not want to move on that, and Trump has long talked about it. He wants to see that gone.
Yeah, sometimes is an understatement. So, JP, what's the risk here for the prime minister politically?
Well, the prime minister's whole brand right during the last federal election campaign was, I'm the guy to take on Trump. I'm the guy who's best placed to deal with this American trade threat. And certainly he's built up a lot of goodwill with the Canadian people because they feel, many of them, that he is the guy to do this. And so it's troubling for him because there haven't been many wins on this file as of late. Certainly the relationship between Trump and Carney is much, much better than what the president had with former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. We saw that very warm welcome in Washington. They were certainly buddy-buddy in Kananaskis at the G7 summit. Much better tone between the two of them than we've seen with other leaders. But I only have to remind you that, he threatened copper tariffs on Canadian exports 2 days ago. He's doubled the steel and aluminum tariffs to 50% and autos. hugely damaging to many sectors here. And we had to roll over on the digital services tax, pull that off the table if we wanted to negotiate with Trump. So there's been a number of irritants that have popped up for Carney. He hasn't been able to post a lot of wins on this file. So the pressure is on for him to deliver a deal. There's not a whole lot of time left. And we're hearing from Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre today, speaking to CBC News, that he wants to see more action. He's not exactly thrilled with the pace of change. And so that is the risk for Carney, that as this deadline approaches, we might not have much to offer in public, at least, and that we also might have to sell a deal that's not quite what Canadians were hoping for. There is a possibility we'll have to live with some tariffs. We might not get them all lifted. Kirsten Hillman, Canada's ambassador to the U.S. and chief negotiator, has suggested that Trump is very much wedded to these tariffs. So it's going to be a tough one for Prime Minister Mark Carney moving forward.
Okay, breaking it all down for us, JP Tasker in Ottawa. Thank you so much for that.
Thanks for having me.
To help make sense of Trump's latest tariff threats, we are joined by Lawrence Herman. He is an international trade lawyer and senior fellow at C.D. Howe Institute, and he joins us from Toronto. Thank you so much, Lawrence, for helping us make sense of all of this. And I want to start with this question on that 35% announced by way of a letter to the Prime Minister. The understanding is that this levy applies to all Canadian exports that don't fall under CUSMA. Help us understand what that means.
Well, helping us to understand what it means is a challenge because there's chaos and unpredictability all across the board, as your previous interviews and comments have said. I think from what I understand, and given what apparently the White House spokespeople have said, the 35% tariffs apply to goods that are not compliant with CUSMA. In other words, the free trade provisions of CUSMA will continue to apply, except in the case where the goods do not meet the rules of origin requirements, in which case tariffs will bump up from 25% to 35%. But all said, it's a weird, unpredictable world where there are no rules. We used to talk about global trading rules. Well, those are gone now. We are now having whatever remains of international trading order determined by executive decisions in the White House. It's a very strange and unpredictable world, and as your reports have said, it's causing tremendous stresses and uncertainties in the Canadian business world.
Yeah, and one thing's for certain, Lawrence, is it keeps international trade lawyers like yourself very busy. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. Lawrence, Trump has often hit back hard on Canada's supply management policies, which has some controls on products like dairy, poultry, and eggs. What role could these policies play in negotiations?
Well, in his last letter and in his previous communications and statements, postings on social media, he's made it clear that supply management is under attack, under assault by the United States. I have to say, we have not made it easier by passing legislation recently, which is now in force, which prevents Canada from negotiating any increases in access under our supply management system in our trade negotiations. So that is now the law of Canada, and it's not going to be easy for the Canadian team to find a way through that law. This is a problem that has been going on for some time. The supply management system has been under assault from the American side. I have to say, though, that under CUSMA, they agreed to supply management continuing in return for increased access to U.S. products. Trump's claim in that bizarre letter he sent out yesterday that we tax U.S. dairy imports at 400% is just fabrication. It's just not the case. But, we're dealing with a fantasy world in the White House. There doesn't seem to be a good grip on reality in some respects. And when you read that letter, it's quite apparent.
And Lawrence, on these moving deadlines, how realistic is a trade resolution by August 1st?
Well, that's a good question. I just can't see a deal being done, a real trade agreement being done by August 1st. I think what we're going to get, if we get that far, if we get back to the table, and there is some indication that we will get back to negotiating with the Americans. I think what we'll have in a few weeks is nothing more than a handshake deal. When I say a handshake deal, I think Mr. Trump and Mr. Carney may shake hands, as Mr. Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, and Mr. Trump did a couple months ago. But a handshake deal is, I guess, worth what you might think with Mr. Trump. The problem is that these deals are very complex and they take a long time to work out. So a framework consummated by a handshake or some agreed letters between Carney and Trump may help to stabilize things somewhat, but there's no guarantee and no reliability on whatever comes out of the White House, I'm afraid to say.
Yeah. And on that point, Lawrence, this is a bit of a long two-part question, but a really important one. One, I'd like to know whether you feel like this 35% tariff hits different than all of the other tariffs announced earlier this year. It almost feels like Canada can't do anything to influence the Trump administration on these negotiations. I mean, we saw Prime Minister Carney rescind the digital services tax. Canada has appointed a fentanyl czar to address the issue of fentanyl coming across the border. Does Canada have any leverage in these trade negotiations? What's your take on that?
I'm not sure we have all that much leverage directly. But what we do have, and I thought with what the Minister of Industry, Madame Joly, said earlier on, is that the strength we do have is our ability to diversify our trading interests. And that's what we have to do it as a country. I fear that Mr. Trump will be relenting in his attacks on Canada, even with some kind of handshake deal or even with an agreement which will not bind him in terms of his tariff policies. He seems to have an unrelenting desire and objective to attack Canada and to harm us economically, commercially, and politically. That's the problem. We are in his crosshairs, and it's going to be very difficult to get out from under that. We have a good team in Ottawa, and they have a strategic sense of how we handle the U.S. situation. But as I said, Canada's strength is diversifying away from an unreliable trading partner south of the border. It's going to take some time, and there'll be some pain, I'm afraid, but that's what we have to do.
Okay, well, the conversation continues. Thank you so much for giving us your insight today. Lawrence Herman, he's an international trade lawyer and senior fellow at C.D. Howe Institute. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.